Alone in the bitter cold of winter. In a quaint little town nestled on the outskirts of Oklahoma, Margaret James sat quietly on the worn leather armchair by the window of her modest wooden house. The December air pressed against the window panes, and the fireplace crackled faintly in the corner, casting shadows across the room. Outside, the prairie winds howled through bare trees, and a gentle snowfall began discreetly covering the streets in a blanket of white silence. To most, this might be a scene of warmth, a portrait of tranquility, but to Margaret, 76 years old and 7 winters into widowhood, the silence was deafening, and the stillness, a reminder of all she had lost. The house was small but full of memories, lovingly built with her late husband Richard James. That same house, once full of laughter, the patter of little feet, Sunday roasts and the hum of country music on the old radio, now stood like a still photograph, unchanged, frozen in time. With Richard gone, Margaret often found herself speaking to him anyway, hoping perhaps the walls still echoed with his comforting voice. "Damn this cold," she muttered, pulling her thick shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her hands trembled slightly, not so much from age, but because arthritis had settled into her knuckles, a newfound companion in recent years. Her eyes, weary and lined with time, often glanced out the window, scanning for something, someone, or perhaps just a distraction from the emptiness. How ironic, she often thought, that she and Richard had worked tirelessly for decades, thinking of a serene and well-earned retirement. Richard used to joke, "Honey, one day we'll sip sweet tea on this porch and yell at kids to keep off the lawn." Margaret laughed at the memory, her laughter fading almost as soon as it came. Without him, there was no sweet tea and no porch conversations, only the echo of a love that had taught her what it meant to feel complete. 7 years. 7 years since the cancer stole him away, slowly at first, and then as swiftly as the Oklahoma wind. What haunted her most about his absence wasn't just the loss, it was the way the house felt, smaller. The walls didn't feel like they hugged her anymore. Instead, they loomed around her, towering, almost mocking her loneliness. The bright side, if there was any, was her son, James Jr., more commonly called Jimmy. Jimmy had been the light of her and Richard's lives, a headstrong boy who grew into a man with his father's stubborn chin and her curious eyes. When she and Richard had gifted him their Denver home as a wedding present years ago, they did so knowing it would provide him and his family the stability they once worked so hard to achieve. "It's Jimmy's turn now," Richard had said, clasping her hands in bed one night with a knowing smile. "We've had our fair share, haven't we?" Jimmy rarely came to visit afterward, and Margaret told herself it was because life in Denver was busy. She imagined him chasing after promotions at his tech job while Tracy, his wife, balanced work and raising their 2 children. She tried not to hold it against them. After all, Jimmy had responsibilities, and Margaret was far too proud to ask for help. Not that she would have expected any. A decade earlier she would have boasted about her independence. Now, sitting in the empty house, she felt that independence was not a blessing but a quietly suffocating weight. Coffee was brewed for one. Winter nights stretched endlessly, marked only by the sound of the warm air furnace humming as her lone company. "You're wallowing again, Maggie," she scolded herself aloud, remembering how Richard used to tease her for letting thoughts drag her down. The town was small enough that she knew most everyone, but as the years passed, she realized that being familiar was not the same as being close. The people made small talk at the pharmacy or waved politely as they drove by, but few truly checked on her. A casserole now and again, sure. Holiday cards at Christmas maybe, but no one lingered, no one mattered, not the way Richard had mattered. The isolation of winter always made it worse. The long nights, the biting air, everything reminded her of the warmth that was missing. For a fleeting moment, she grabbed at their old checkered blanket that Richard used to spread out at picnics. It still smelled faintly of mothballs and pine cleaner now, not him. "Time to shake things up, Maggie," she whispered to herself, trying to muster some resolve. But try as she might, her resolve often faltered. A woman alone didn't often have the energy to fight the cold winters in her heart. Her eyes fell on a picture frame resting by the fireplace mantel, a faded photo of her, Richard, and little Jimmy, taken during an unusually cool summer outside the Denver house. Jimmy had been all of 10 years old, his face round with the toothy grin of a boy not yet burdened by life's challenges. As the snow fell outside, Margaret fingered the edge of the frame, tracing each face. "Maybe it's time," she whispered, though she wasn't quite sure who she was speaking to. She put the frame back with a gentle clink. Margaret stood up, her knees creaking audibly. The pain from an old fall throbbed faintly, a reminder of her age and fragility. She reached for the phone but hesitated. "Denver," she whispered to herself, testing the word on her lips. The thought of going there, of seeing Jimmy, filled her with equal parts excitement and dread. Finally, she dialed the bus services to inquire about tickets, her voice shaking as she booked the soonest one. She convinced herself that Jimmy would be happy, that her arrival would bring warmth to cold, distant days. But deep down, there remained a whisper of doubt, one Margaret was too scared to put into words. What if they didn't need her anymore? What if her memories of a family united were just that? Memories. The decision to visit her son. For days, Margaret wrestled with the thought of leaving her house. Every corner of the old wooden home seemed to plead for her to stay, to hold steady in her solitude. The glossy photographs on the dresser, faded wedding pictures, snapshots of young Jimmy during his Little League games, and even a Polaroid of her and Richard pursuing a picnic along the Oklahoma plains, all reminded her of a time when life felt brimming and whole. But those glimpses of a youthful family, a family that once surrounded her with love, only intensified the gnawing ache in her chest. She sat at the kitchen table one morning, contemplating her options, while staring at a chipped coffee mug Richard had loved. Without him, the silence of that kitchen was overwhelming, a vacuum that no amount of humming or radio static could quite fill. "I'm too old to feel so invisible," she thought. Her tea had gone cold, but she sipped it nonetheless, eyes narrowing as they lingered on Ethel Jenkins's Christmas card pinned to the refrigerator door. The elder Jenkins often hosted dinner parties for her children and grandchildren in town. Laughter could often be heard resonating from her home. Margaret couldn't help but envy that warmth. "I shouldn't wallow," she muttered out loud, shaking her head as though chastising herself. But self-scolding wasn't enough to erase the loneliness gnawing at her bones. The decision to visit Jimmy wasn't made lightly. The idea had started small, like a pebble at the edge of a hill, but it gained momentum over time. For Margaret, Denver wasn't just about stepping into the house she and Richard had given their son for his wedding. It symbolized hope, a reminder of the legacy she and Richard had worked so hard to build. That house was suffused with the echoes of their love, their sacrifices, and their dreams for their only child. "Face it, Maggie," she mumbled, "if you don't go see him, you're just gonna sit here and rot." But another inner voice fought back, whispering doubts and fears. What if Jimmy and Tracy were too busy? What if the visit wasn't welcome? She dismissed the thoughts as nagging insecurities, but they lingered in dark corners of her mind nonetheless. Sitting at the edge of her bed that evening with the photo of little Jimmy in her lap, Margaret wondered how life could change so much. Jimmy had promised her and Richard the world when they signed over the house to him and Tracy. He had sworn to be a good son, to visit often, to bring the kids around. "Mom, Dad, I'll make you proud," he'd said with that confident devil-may-care grin of his. That was years ago, though. Life had a way of swallowing promises. Still, she clung to her faith in him. Jimmy was her son, stubborn like his father, but with a heart as big as hers. Margaret was convinced that deep down, he still cared. Maybe he just needed a reminder. Maybe her visit could rekindle a closeness that time had eroded. She told herself that it wasn't about confrontation or disappointment, it was about connection. If their relationship felt fractured now, there was no better time to start bridging the gaps. The first real wave of resolve hit her after a restless night, curled into cold bedsheets and staring blankly at the ceiling. Snow fell heavily outside, and the hushed world beyond her windows seemed to whisper the same advice. "Go, Margaret. You're not getting any younger." She made up her mind shortly before dawn. By the next afternoon, the phone was in her hand, and she punched in the number for the local bus depot. The line rang twice before a cheerful woman answered. "Oklahoma City Transit, how can I help you?" Margaret cleared her throat, suddenly nervous. "Yes, ma'am, I'm looking to book a ticket to Denver. Doesn't have to be fancy, but soon." "Absolutely," the woman chirped. "We've got a departure Sunday morning. Early. Will that work for you?" "Sunday sounds fine," Margaret replied, biting her lip. "How much?" The fare wasn't exorbitant, but to Margaret it seemed a small fortune. She hesitated. Was this worth it? Was she being impulsive? "Oh, just book the damn ticket," she muttered to herself, sounding more like Richard than anyone else. "Ma'am?" asked the dispatcher. "Never mind, Sunday it is, thank you," she confirmed, and the phone clicked as the booking was finalized. With the trip set, there was no turning back. Margaret's mind buzzed with possibilities as she folded little piles of clothing onto her worn bedspread, her winter coat, a thick scarf Jimmy had gifted her 3 birthdays ago, and a tin of cookies she'd baked as a peace offering. Her suitcase wasn't fancy, and its zipper stuttered with age, but it suited the journey. Each little decision felt monumental. What would her words to Jimmy be when he opened the door? Would Tracy scold her for showing up unannounced? Would the grandkids even remember her? That evening she called a neighbor, Helen, to ask if she'd keep an eye on the house. "I'm off to visit my son in Denver," she explained, the tone of her voice carefully upbeat. Helen hesitated on the other end. "You're going there alone, Maggie?" "Oh, it's nothing. Just a short trip," Margaret replied, brushing off the concern with an imaginary wave. But Helen's quiet sigh reminded her how vulnerable Margaret felt, despite her facade of confidence. That Sunday morning, Margaret stood outside the bus station with her worn suitcase, clutching her ticket as though it were made of gold. The wind cut sharply, and her knees ached from an old injury, but none of that mattered. As the headlights of the arriving Denver-bound bus illuminated the lonely parking lot, Margaret whispered softly to herself, "Let's see if they still need me." By the time she settled into her seat and the bus pulled away, the snow-dusted prairie began falling behind in the rear-view window. Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She was heading toward a future uncertain, to a family she hoped still saw her as more than just a ghost of their past. Whatever Denver would bring, she knew she couldn't stay buried in her memories forever. It was time to face the living and find warmth again, even if it meant enduring a few cold shoulders along the way. The cold rejection. The bus ride to Denver had felt like a lifetime to Margaret. As the snow-covered Oklahoma plains gave way to the jagged Colorado Rockies, she clutched the tin of cookies tighter in her lap, as if holding onto it might somehow bring her comfort or courage. By the time the bus pulled into the terminal, her legs were stiff, her back ached, and her nerves hummed with uncertainty. Every mile of the journey, she had rehearsed in her head how she would greet her son. She'd knock gently on the door, and when Jimmy opened it, she imagined the surprise on his face would melt into a hug. "Mom, what are you doing here?" he'd ask, and she'd reply, "I missed you, Jimmy. I just wanted to see you all." That was the dream. Reality, however, was rarely as kind. Margaret arrived at the house in the mid-afternoon, the sun already dipping low behind snow-dusted rooftops. For a moment, as she stood on the porch looking at the house she and Richard had sacrificed so much to buy, she felt a strange blend of pride and unease. There it was, the Denver home, richer and more polished than she remembered. The shutters had been repainted a crisp navy blue, and new landscaping lined the front yard. Tracy, a lover of modern decor, had clearly made her mark. Margaret smoothed her coat and adjusted the scarf Jimmy had given her years ago, then knocked on the door. Her knuckles barely brushed the polished wood when she heard footsteps. The door creaked open, revealing Jimmy's familiar face, older now, more worn. His brown eyes, once so reminiscent of her late husband, blinked in what Margaret hoped was surprise, but the feeling didn't last long. "Mom?" Jimmy said, his tone caught somewhere between confusion and apprehension. He didn't reach for a hug, and when the door cracked wider, Tracy appeared behind him. For a moment it was as if the world stood still. Margaret smiled uneasily, her voice soft yet hopeful. "Hi, Jimmy." "Hi, Tracy, I thought I'd stop by for a visit. It's been too long and, well, I just wanted to see everyone. The kids too." Jimmy exchanged a glance with Tracy, and something tightened in the air. Tracy's lips pressed into a thin line, her silence sharper than words. Margaret could sense the tension immediately, but she pressed on, holding up the tin of cookies like an olive branch. "I baked these this morning. They're ginger snaps, your favorite growing up." Jimmy scratched the back of his neck, offering a nervous chuckle. "Well, Mom, this is, unexpected. You didn't call or anything." "I know," Margaret admitted quickly. "I just thought, well, I figured a little surprise might be nice." Her voice wavered slightly, but she steadied herself. "Don't worry, I'm not here to impose. I thought I'd stay just one night, maybe two, if that's okay." From behind Jimmy, Tracy finally spoke, her words soft but cold as ice. "Oh, Margaret, it's just that we've been so busy lately. Work, school for the kids. Everything's been hectic. You know how it is." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "If you'd called ahead, we could have planned something better, but this, well, it's just not a great time." Not a great time. The phrase hung in the air, stinging Margaret like a slap. She opened her mouth to reply but couldn't find the words. Her eyes darted from Tracy's expressionless face to Jimmy's fidgeting hands to the tiny movement of the door, as if he were already preparing to close it. "But," Margaret started, her voice barely above a whisper, "I've come all this way. I won't be any trouble. I was hoping to just spend a little time. It's been such a long time since I've seen you all, Since I've seen my grandchildren." Tracy folded her arms, leaning slightly against the door frame. Her voice turned clipped. "The kids are actually coming down with colds, and we've got a lot going on this weekend, I'm sure you understand." Her words were polite enough, but the frost in her delivery was undeniable. Jimmy's face flushed, not with anger or embarrassment but with guilt. Even so, he said nothing, only nodded limply as if Tracy's words bore more weight than his mother's. Margaret clenched her hands tighter around the tin of cookies until the cold metal bit into her skin. "I promise, I'll be quiet, I just wanted to—" Her sentence trailed off as her gaze moved to Jimmy. Her son met her eyes briefly, but there was none of the warmth she'd longed for, only hesitation. Then came the final blow delivered by Jimmy's soft, almost sheepish voice. "Mom, this house is ours now. We're the ones living here and we've got our routine. Maybe it's best if you let us know ahead next time, so we can plan." The words struck her chest, sinking deeper with every syllable. The repetition of "we," as if to emphasize their separation, as if to remind her that the house, her house, was no longer hers, hurt more than she cared to admit. "Mom, it's our house now." She needed a moment to process how she'd gone from the woman who gave them everything to a guest who needed to let them know ahead. Her anguish barely masked, Margaret smiled a shaky smile. "Of course," she murmured. "I understand, I didn't mean to intrude." She glanced down at the tin of cookies in her hands, suddenly feeling foolish for bringing them. With trembling fingers she held it out. "Here, at least take these for the kids." Jimmy hesitated, glancing back at Tracy, who made no move to accept the offering. Finally, he reached out awkwardly and took the tin. "Thanks, Mom," he muttered, but his gratitude lacked enthusiasm. Margaret waited for an invitation that would never come, for some flicker of warmth. But none arrived. Jimmy shuffled uneasily, Tracy glanced at her watch, and the silence stretched unbearably thin between them. Finally, summoning what little dignity she had left, Margaret adjusted her scarf, nodded, and stepped off the porch. She didn't look back as she headed toward the bus stop, her footsteps muffled by the snow. Behind her, she heard the front door close with a quiet click, final, mechanical, and devastatingly clear. She wasn't welcome here, not like she had imagined. As Margaret trudged away, the weight of their rejection grew heavier with each step. Her mind buzzed with unanswered questions and sad realizations. This wasn't what she had envisioned. This wasn't family. She gripped her coat tightly against the chill, but no amount of fabric could warm the aching void that had settled in her heart. Memories of hard times. As Margaret boarded the bus to make her way back to Oklahoma, the cold rejection of her visit replayed in her mind like a broken record. To drown out the sound of the door shutting and the strained voices of her son and daughter-in-law, she let her thoughts drift back to a time when life had been hard, but it had been full of meaning. The house in Denver wasn't just a home, it was a testament to sacrifice. Margaret closed her eyes, letting herself relive the grueling years when she and Richard had worked tirelessly to make that dream come true for Jimmy. Richard had been the kind of man who would work himself to the bone without a word of complaint. During the day, he repaired cars at the local garage, his hands constantly covered in oil and grease. In the evenings, while most men came home to relax in front of the television, Richard took on a second job. Margaret could still see him in her mind, delivering supplies to warehouses under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights, his shoulders hunched but steady under the weight of boxes. For her part, Margaret had picked up where he left off. Her hours at the local grocery store started early, long before the sun rose, stacking shelves and ringing up customers. She took on mending work at home at night, stitching torn jackets and hemming children's clothes until her eyes were too heavy to stay open. Every dollar earned went into one account, the future fund for Jimmy. They scrimped and saved, cutting costs wherever they could. Lunch was often nothing more than peanut butter sandwiches or a thermos of lukewarm soup. Margaret could still remember the bitter flavor of reheated instant coffee they shared in paper cups as they planned out their finances late at night. "Do you think we'll ever be able to afford it?" she had asked Richard one night, staring at the stack of unpaid bills spread across the kitchen table. Richard, sitting across from her, had smirked in that easy way of his, tapping one calloused finger against the paper. "We'll figure something out, Maggie, we always do." His voice had been so calm, even when there was nothing certain about their plan. That confidence, that unwavering belief in their ability to press forward, had been what kept her going. The dream of buying a home in Denver, somewhere that Jimmy could start a family and build a future, became their shared goal. "It has to be in a good district," Richard remembered saying often. "Somewhere the grandkids can go to a decent school, somewhere safe." When the opportunity finally came, a modest two-bedroom home on the outskirts of Denver with a small yard, Margaret and Richard didn't hesitate. The asking price was steep considering their earnings, but they managed to scrape together a down payment by taking on even more work. Margaret doubled her sewing jobs during the evenings, and Richard began working weekend shifts at an animal hospital as a night emergency vet, a temporary gig he picked up in retirement. She still remembered the way he smiled one morning, his back aching as he stretched after a long shift. "You're too old to be pulling an all-nighter," she had teased him, handing him a mug of coffee. Richard shrugged, his lips quirking up slightly. "Somebody's got to take care of the critters who don't have anyone else. Poor things don't know it's the middle of the night." Margaret had only shaken her head, but deep down she had admired him. He'd spent nights wrapping the sprained paws of farm dogs or holding trembling kittens abandoned in the cold. For him, there had been no complaint. It was simply something that had to be done. Those years were hard. There were nights when they would sit down for dinner together, if you could even call it that. More often than not, dinner was fast food warmed up in the microwave or whatever leftovers the store marked at half price before closing. "It's not about the journey," Richard had joked one night as he stirred packets of powdered soup into hot water. "It's about the house at the end of it." They'd laughed over their meager meal, but there'd been pride behind it too. The Denver house was theirs after months of back-breaking work, but not without strings attached. They had to take out a significant bank loan to close the deal, and Margaret still remembered how sleepless both she and Richard were in the months leading up to the move, trying to figure out whether the investment was truly worth it. "This house, it's going to be our retirement too, you know," Richard had murmured one night, glancing at their growing bank debts. Margaret had bitten her lip, staring into her coffee cup. "Jimmy's going to need it though. What'll people say if we can't even buy our own son a home?" "You know we're giving up more than money, Maggie," Richard had said, his brow furrowed. "We're giving up time." Margaret had sighed but nodded, knowing it was too late to second-guess the decision. They had done it for love, for their son. She remembered the day they handed over the keys to Jimmy and Tracy. They'd thrown a small housewarming party. Margaret had baked a casserole and Jimmy promised he would honor everything they had done. "You guys don't have to worry about anything anymore," Jimmy had said, pulling his father in for a rare hug. "This house means the world to us. We'll always take care of it, and you." Even Tracy had chimed in with a smile. "You did so much for us, Margaret. I hope you know how much we appreciate it." Back then, Margaret had believed it. She and Richard had both believed it. They had left Denver feeling like they had given Jimmy and Tracy not just a house but a future. But those memories now felt like faint echoes. Sitting on the bus, Margaret gripped her small handbag tightly, her thoughts flooded with the sacrifices they'd made. The late nights, the missed breakfasts, the scrimping and saving for years, only for it all to boil down to a visit that ended with, "Let us know ahead next time." The love and hope in their investment felt diminished, overshadowed by the cold rejection. She stared out the frosty bus window at the vast white plains sweeping past, tracing her finger across the cold glass. Somewhere far in the distance, the sun dipped lower into the horizon as if retreating into the earth. Margaret wondered what Richard would say if he were sitting beside her now. Would he laugh it off? Would he tell her she'd done enough? But she knew the answer. Richard wouldn't have let that rejection stand unanswered. And as the dark began to settle over the landscape, Margaret felt something stir faintly in her chest. The last conversation with her husband. Margaret closed her eyes as the bus bumped along the icy road. The memories that had been tugging at her heart all day rose to the surface, unbidden. She thought back to the last few weeks with Richard before he passed. Even as his strength faded, his voice had remained steady, deliberate, full of the same resilience that had carried their family through so many hardships. He had always been her partner in everything, the man she could rely on, and thinking back to his words during those final days, now felt like sifting through treasures buried deep beneath the pain of loss. It had been a gray afternoon in late February when they had the conversation. Richard had been lying in their bedroom surrounded by the muted hum of the oxygen machine and the faint smell of antiseptic. The sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains Margaret had sewn decades ago, casting pale streaks across his face. She'd been sitting beside him with her hands in her lap, trying to smile and brush away the tears that seemed to threaten her constantly in those weeks. "Look at you," he had whispered, his once strong voice dry and scratchy. "Still trying to hold it together, Maggie. You've always been the tough one." Margaret shook her head, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Don't talk like that, Richard. We've still got time." He smiled faintly, a crooked, knowing smile. Don't sugarcoat it for me, hun. This old body's about run its course. You said you wanted honesty when we built a life together, right? He struggled to clear his throat before continuing, his eyes on her. I need you to listen, Maggie. Not just hear me, but really listen this time. She nodded, biting down on her trembling lip. I'm listening, Richard. His hand, raw and thin from the countless IVs, reached out to softly cover hers. The touch was so familiar, yet so heartbreakingly fragile. You're going to be okay, he started. I know you don't believe that yet, but you're the strongest woman I know. I just want to make sure, well, that you'll stand up for yourself when you need to. Promise me, Maggie, you won't let people walk all over you, even if it's the ones you love. Margaret frowned, her brow furrowing. What are you talking about, Richard? No one's walking over me. But his weak laugh in response told her he saw through her protests. You know what I mean. Life's cruel, Maggie. People forget things, promises, sacrifices, even their love sometimes. Hell, not because they're bad people, but because it's easy to take folks for granted when life gets comfortable. Make sure they don't forget what you've done for them, Maggie. Make sure Jimmy doesn't forget. Her heart tensed at the mention of their son. Jimmy loves us, Richard. You know he does. He's just got his own family now, his own responsibilities. Richard's gaze held hers, serious now. Jimmy's a good boy, but he's not perfect. None of us are. He's going to mess up one way or another. That's just life. But if he messes up so bad it hurts you, you do what you have to do, Maggie. Do you understand me? What do you expect me to do, Richard? She asked softly. Her voice was shaky, her hands trembling beneath his. He paused, his eyes softer now as he let out a long, slow breath. I left something for you, he said finally. His words came deliberately, as if he had been saving this part for just the right moment. In the bottom drawer of the old desk, he gestured weakly toward the corner of the room. It's a contract, legal documents for the house in Denver. I made sure of it before we handed it over, to protect you, Maggie. Her tears slipped free and she struggled to find her voice. What do you mean? What kind of contract? Richard's hand tightened faintly over hers. It's simple. If something ever happens, if Jimmy or Tracy, if they ever forget everything we did to give them that home, or if they ever mistreat you, the ownership of the house goes back to you. No questions asked, no fights needed. It was my way of ensuring that no one could take your dignity from you, Maggie, not even family. Richard, I can't do that, she whispered, shaking her head adamantly. That's Jimmy's house now. He's building his family there. It's our house, Maggie, Richard corrected her. It'll always be ours. We busted our backs to get it. We sacrificed for it. And we didn't give it to him just because we had to. We gave it to him because we believed he'd honor that sacrifice. But if he doesn't? He paused, his voice rough but resolute. You use that contract. You don't let guilt, or love for that matter, keep you from doing what's right for yourself. Margaret sniffled, clutching his hand tightly as though she could hold on to him forever that way. Why are you doing this, Richard? Why are you talking like this? Because, he said, after I'm gone, there won't be anyone else to remind you of your worth. I want you to carry that reminder with you. You've given your whole life for this family, Maggie, and if they forget that, if they let the dust of life cloud their memories, you dust it off for them. You hear me? His words lingered long after the conversation ended. At the time, Margaret had thought it was all unnecessary. Jimmy would never forget. He'd never disrespect her. But now, sitting on the bus heading home, the sound of Jimmy's hesitant, cold words, "Let us know ahead next time," echoed in her ears. As the distance between Denver and Oklahoma grew, Margaret felt a new weight in her heart, heavier than before. Richard had known something she hadn't. And that folded piece of paper, buried in the bottom drawer of the old desk, felt suddenly like a lifeline she never expected to need. Margaret whispered into the quiet bus as if speaking to Richard. You were always one step ahead, weren't you, Richie? You knew this might happen. You prepared me in your own way. What now? Do I use it? Do I speak up? Or do I keep swallowing this loneliness like I always have? The bus rattled softly beneath her, but Richard's words echoed clearly in her mind once more. Don't let anyone forget your worth, Maggie. Not even your son. A firm decision. Margaret sat at her dining table, the house unnervingly quiet around her. The gentle hum of the furnace felt louder than ever, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards beneath her chair. Spread out in front of her was a document she hadn't touched in years, a contract, its yellowing paper neatly folded into thirds. Her name and Richard's signature stared back at her in bold ink that seemed permanent, unyielding against the passage of time. She had returned from Denver several days earlier, but the emotional weight of the trip lingered like a heavy cloud over her. Jimmy's hesitant, detached words echoed in her mind. "This house is ours now." And Tracy's sharp voice still bit at her. "It's not a good time. You should have let us know ahead." Margaret couldn't shake the biting realization that the sacrifice she and Richard had made for Jimmy and his family, years of toil, of poured-out love and selfless giving, had somehow been forgotten, replaced, dismissed. Her hands rested on the smooth grain of the table as she stared at the Denver house's original deeds and the attached legal addendum that Richard had so quietly, so carefully put in place. She had thought about this conversation endlessly since returning home. It wasn't anger that overwhelmed her. Not exactly. It was disappointment. Deep, raw, unshakable. All she could replay in her mind was the way the door to Jimmy's home had closed behind her, the click final and indifferent, leaving her standing on the snow-dusted porch like an outsider. "You always knew, didn't you, Richie?" Margaret murmured aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked at the paper as if it contained more than signatures and clauses, as if it contained her late husband's voice, urging her to make the painful decision. He had foreseen this moment, had somehow known that life wouldn't always be kind, even from the people they loved most. Richard's voice floated into her memory again. "Maggie, promise me you won't let anyone take your dignity from you, not even your son." It was easy for people to say, "Family is family, let things go, give them time." Margaret herself had believed in giving grace for so many years, giving Jimmy the benefit of the doubt long after their visits had dwindled, long after the phone calls had turned into short and sporadic texts. But Denver had been the breaking point, and the wound felt irreparable. Jimmy wasn't cruel, Margaret believed that in her heart, but he wasn't considerate either, and it was inexcusable to let her travel hundreds of miles, only to send her away with stiff smiles and cold excuses. Worse, Tracy's clipped words and unwillingness to even accept cookies felt like utter disregard for Margaret's role in their lives. This wasn't what family was supposed to be. She and Richard had worked too hard, given too much, to allow this feeling to go unaddressed. She pushed herself up from the chair, her knees creaking quietly with protest, and walked to the corner of the room where the faint smell of pine still hung from the small but sturdy wooden desk they had saved for years to buy. Richard had loved that desk. For decades it had been the place where they paid their bills, budgeted their savings, drafted holiday cards, and made plans. It was the desk where he had gathered Margaret's trembling hand into his so many years ago, tucking a pen into her fingers with steady patience. "Just in case," he had said with a sad smile when they signed the deed over to Jimmy. She hadn't argued then, she didn't have the heart to, but now, that sliver of protection he'd added felt like a lifeline. Opening one of the drawers, she retrieved the well-worn envelope where Richard had tucked the original paperwork. Margaret took it back to the table, smoothing out the folds. Her fingers ran along the familiar lines of text, pausing at the section Richard had always told her she might one day need. In the event of neglect, misuse, or lack of adherence to agreed terms, ownership can immediately revert to Margaret James without prior notice. Neglect, misuse, lack of adherence. Those words had echoed in her mind since she left the Denver bus terminal and stepped back into her lonely home. This wasn't about a house, Margaret knew that. This wasn't even about reclaiming some physical space filled with yellowing wallpaper and polished hardwood floors. This was about the principle, the symbol, the understanding that the years of sacrifice, love, and tireless work she and Richard had poured out for Jimmy, and, by extension, Tracy and their grandchildren, had worth, had meaning. And if Jimmy had forgotten, then this was the only way Margaret knew to remind him. The next morning Margaret set out to the office of the local attorney who'd handled the house transfer years ago. It was a gray, wintry day, but she bundled herself tightly in her thick scarf and wool coat. The icy wind bit at her cheeks as she walked into the small brick building, clutching the familiar envelope to her chest. The young secretary at the front desk offered her a warm, obliging smile, but Margaret felt restless as she straightened her shoulders, preparing herself for the next step. The attorney, Mr. Ronald Klein, still remembered Margaret. His slight surprise at her phone call earlier now gave way to quiet professionalism. She placed the paperwork carefully on his desk and sat down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I want to initiate the terms Richard had set forth," she said simply, her voice steady even though her chest felt heavy. Klein adjusted his glasses, scanning over the documents. "Mrs. James, I understand, but this is a major decision. Can I ask if you've spoken to Jimmy about how you're feeling?" Margaret's lips pressed together for a moment before she answered with deliberate resolve. I spoke by showing up in Denver. Maybe I should have called. Maybe I should have written, but at the end of the day, I stood on his porch as his mother and he sent me away. I love my son, Mr. Klein, but sometimes love has to come with boundaries. Klein studied her face carefully before nodding. Very well, Mrs. James. Legally, everything seems airtight here. We'll draw up a formal notice and file it appropriately. If they contest it, they'll need solid evidence to challenge you, though by the terms Richard set, it would be nearly impossible. Would they be evicted? Margaret asked, her voice softer now. They'll have 30 days from the notice to vacate, Klein confirmed. For a long moment Margaret stared at the thin paper on the desk. It seemed so fragile, this document that now held the power to redefine her relationship with her son. But fragile or not, it was her turn to stand firm, for what Richard would have wanted, for her dignity, and, in a way, even for Jimmy's understanding of gratitude. As she walked back out into the cold, papers safely tucked inside her bag, Margaret drew a deep breath of icy air. It was a firm decision, but it was the right one, for herself, for the sacrifices she and Richard had made, and maybe even for Jimmy to learn the lessons Richard had feared he'd forget. Margaret whispered into the still wind, as if Richard could hear her. You always knew, Richie. I'm doing this for both of us. And for the first time since that door had closed in Denver, she felt a strange kind of warmth, a spark of self-respect that had lain dormant for far too long. Taking legal action. Margaret sat at home for days after her meeting with Mr. Klein, staring at the envelope holding the copies of the legal documents she'd filed. It was a tangible thing, a silent presence that demanded her attention even when she tried to bury it among the pile of newspapers and letters on the counter. The weight of what she'd done was settling in, uneasily giving rise to a mixture of determination and guilt. She had filed the papers. Jimmy and Tracy would be notified soon, formally by mail. The thought of it filled her with both dread and resolve. She wasn't someone who reveled in conflict. Conflict didn't suit her, never had. Margaret was raised with the notion that a sharp tongue did little but unsettle the peace, and she had spent her life avoiding unnecessary tension. Yet here she was, doing the very thing she once thought unthinkable, reclaiming the home she and Richard had bled and toiled for, long before Jimmy had ever heard the word mortgage. The official notice, worded precisely and coldly, would arrive in Denver by the week's end. It stated that Jimmy and Tracy had 30 days to vacate the house, as per the clauses in the ownership agreement. Margaret had gone over the words multiple times before under Mr. Klein's watchful eye, due to neglect and violation of agreed terms, as stipulated in the legal addendum, the property located at... It had all sounded so harsh, so clinical. Still, the terms had been laid bare by Richard long before, and Margaret was now honoring her late husband's foresight. It wasn't until the phone rang a few days later that the reality truly began to unfold. Margaret didn't need to check the caller ID to know who it was. She had been expecting the call since the moment she left the attorney's office. She let it ring twice, taking a moment to steady her breathing and plant her feet firmly on the kitchen tile before picking up. "Hi, Jimmy," she said gently, her voice calm yet strained. "Mom," Jimmy began, his tone tight. He didn't greet her warmly, and Margaret could almost hear the tension radiating through the phone line. We just got something in the mail, from your lawyer." Margaret closed her eyes and drew a deep breath, bracing herself for what was to come. "I know, Jimmy. I expected you'd get it by now." There was a pause on the other end, then a sharp exhale. "Mom, what the hell is going on? Did you really... are you seriously trying to take the house away? Our house?" His voice was rising now, tinged with equal parts disbelief and offense. "It's not your house, Jimmy," Margaret said softly, yet firmly. "It was never fully yours. Your father and I gave it to you with trust, but we also put protections in place, terms that were clear from the start, and I'm sorry, but after everything that happened when I was there, you left me no choice." "No choice?" Jimmy repeated, his tone incredulous. "How does showing up unannounced and then leaving upset justify taking the house away from us? Mom, this is insane!" Margaret steadied herself against the kitchen counter, the cold edge pressing into her palm. "It wasn't just about that visit, Jimmy. You know it wasn't just about that. I've been waiting for years, waiting for you to come around, waiting for you to call, to visit, to include me in your lives. But when I finally gathered myself up and came to see you, what did you do? You turned me away." "I didn't turn you away," Jimmy argued, his voice defensive. "It was just bad timing, Mom. Tracy and I were swamped, and the kids were sick. What did you expect us to do?" "I expected you to let me in," Margaret snapped, the rare sharpness in her tone cutting through the conversation like a knife. I expected you to want to see me, to care that I'd traveled hundreds of miles alone just to be near you. But instead, I stood on that porch, and Tracy looked at me like I was a burden, like I didn't have a right to be there. Jimmy was quiet for a long moment, but Margaret could still hear his uneven breathing. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, almost pleading. Mom, you don't need to do this. We'll do better. I'll call you more, okay? We can plan a visit. You don't have to go this far. Margaret's voice softened, but the resolve in her words remained unshaken. It's not just about promises, Jimmy. Promises don't mean anything if they're broken over and over again. This house, it's more than a deed or a place to live. It's everything your father and I worked for. It's our sacrifices, our love, our legacy. And you forgot that. You forgot us, Jimmy. I didn't forget, he said quietly, but the lack of conviction in his tone said otherwise. Another voice suddenly joined in from the background, faint but unmistakable. Tracy. Is she serious about this? Are you really going to let her do this? Margaret could barely make out the rest, but the words unfair and ridiculous came through clearly enough. Jimmy returned to the line, his voice tighter now, a defensive edge creeping in. Look, Mom, I get that you feel hurt, okay? I get it. But taking the house away, kicking us out, that's too much. We have 2 kids. Where are we supposed to go? Margaret winced, the maternal part of her aching at the thought of her grandchildren being displaced. But Richard's voice echoed in her mind again. Don't let guilt keep you from doing what's right. You have 30 days, Jimmy, she said firmly. That's more notice than I got when you sent me away. The conversation ended shortly after, Jimmy hanging up with a frustrated muttered goodbye that left Margaret standing in the kitchen, staring at the phone in her hand. Her body trembled, not with anger, but with exhaustion, the kind of fatigue that came from carrying the weight of heartbreak. As the days passed, she received more calls. Some were from Jimmy, others from Tracy. The tone ranged from pleading to anger, their words shifting between apologies and accusations. Margaret met all of them with the same calm, consistent response. You knew this was in the agreement. Your father made sure of it. Soon, the calls slowed, then stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and Margaret spent lonely evenings in her dimly lit house, second-guessing herself. But each time doubt crept in, she reached for the folded copy of the paperwork on the counter, Richard's signature at the bottom grounding her. When the 30 days ended, Margaret received an update from Mr. Klein. They've moved out, he said plainly. The property is legally yours again. Do you want me to arrange a visit to inspect it? Margaret nodded, though the thought of walking into that house again filled her with equal parts nostalgia and sadness. Yes, she replied, I think it's time. The house, though empty, no longer felt like someone else's. It felt like hers again. As Margaret stood in the doorway, breathing in the stillness, she whispered to herself, We did it, Richie. Finally stood up for what we gave, for what we're worth. Family conflict. The legal notice had landed in Jimmy and Tracy's mailbox, just as Margaret had expected. She had braced herself for the fallout, spent long, sleepless nights going over what she would say, and how she would defend herself. She felt the burden of the decision, but every time the guilt crept too close, she reminded herself of the cold reception on Jimmy's porch, and the sacrifices she and Richard had made. When the phone rang again one evening, Margaret sighed, already knowing who was on the other end. She let it ring a few times as if the delay might fortify her resolve. Finally she answered, her tone neutral and steady. Hello? Mom! Jimmy's voice practically crackled with restrained anger. He didn't lead with any pleasantries. I can't believe you're really doing this. Tracy just opened the mail and, what the hell, Mom? Margaret leaned against the counter, gripping the receiver firmly. She had anticipated anger, but Jimmy's tone still stung. Jimmy, I sent that notice because I had to. Your father and I made those terms for a reason, and you know that. You had to? Jimmy's voice rose with disbelief. No, Mom, you wanted to. Let's be honest here. You're mad about that visit. Fine, I get it. Maybe it wasn't a warm welcome, but filing legal papers to take the house from us. That's going nuclear. You didn't even warn us. Margaret's jaw tightened. Jimmy, this isn't just about that visit. That was the tipping point. Yes, but this has been building for years. Do you know how long I've waited for a phone call that wasn't just about work or the kids' birthdays? Or for you to visit me instead of sending a text saying you're too busy? I came to Denver because I was tired of waiting, and when I got there... Her voice wavered momentarily but quickly found strength again. I was treated like an inconvenience. Jimmy let out a frustrated sigh on the other end of the line. Mom, we've got a life here, okay? Responsibilities, the kids, work, all of it. It's not easy to balance everything. You caught us off guard, that's all. Tracy's got her hands full and Don't, Margaret interrupted firmly. Don't use busyness as your excuse, Jimmy. Everyone has responsibilities, but family should still matter. Do you know how quiet this house is? It used to be filled with laughter, yours and your father's. Now I sit here day after day waiting for someone to remember me, and when I finally came to you, the only thing I got was snow on my boots and a closed door. That's not fair, Jimmy snapped. His defensiveness sharpened his voice. How can you say that I don't care? I've done my part, Mom. This past decade hasn't exactly been easy for us either. You gave the house to me, and I've tried to make it work for my family. What else do you want from me? Margaret closed her eyes and drew a deep, steadying breath. What I want, Jimmy, is acknowledgement. I want respect for what your father and I sacrificed. That house represents everything we worked for, every long night we spent earning money to give you a better life. And now you're telling me that you've done your part? What part is that exactly? You're twisting this around, Jimmy protested. We're not perfect, okay? Maybe I could have called more or planned a visit, but no one's ever perfect with this kind of stuff. Families are messy. You don't pull stuff like this because of normal family hiccups. Margaret's voice turned colder now, her patience thinning. Jimmy, this isn't a hiccup. This is about years of being ignored while you enjoyed the very thing I worked so hard to give you. You don't get to dismiss me or act like I'm just being dramatic. The terms were clear from the start. If you failed to show responsibility, the house wouldn't stay yours. Your father foresaw this situation, whether we wanted to admit it or not, and now I'm just following through. There was a pause, a heavy silence on Jimmy's end, and then a faint, distant voice. Tracy. What is she saying now? The irritation in her tone was unmistakable, though Margaret couldn't make out the specific words. Hang on, Jimmy grumbled toward his wife before returning to the phone. Mom, you want to talk about responsibility? Fine, let's talk about it. You said you gave us that house out of love. You said this was for my family. Now you're just ripping it away like all of that was some kind of joke. How's that showing responsibility on your end? Margaret felt her chest tighten, her son's accusation tugging at both her guilt and her frustration. Jimmy, your father and I didn't sacrifice so much to be forgotten. This isn't about me being vindictive. This is about reminding you what that house means. To me, to your father's memory. I can't stand by and let it become just another structure to you. And what about the kids, huh? Did you think about them? Jimmy said, his voice laced with bitterness now. Where do you think we're supposed to go? We built our lives here, Mom. The boys are in school. We can't just pack up and leave because you're upset about a visit. Margaret's voice softened, but only slightly. I did think about them, Jimmy. I think about them all the time. Do you think this is easy for me? I love those boys. But this isn't just your family's life we're talking about. It's mine, too. And in case you've forgotten, this was supposed to be about sharing that life, not shutting me out of it. Jimmy's voice dropped to a low, weary grumble. So what? That's it? We're being punished? You're making an example out of us? This isn't punishment, Margaret said firmly. This is about boundaries, something your father taught me to set so that I wouldn't lose myself, not to you, not to anyone. He always worried I'd let guilt or love cloud my judgment. He was right to worry. There was another long pause. Margaret could hear Jimmy breathing on the other end, his frustration palpable. I can't talk about this anymore, he said finally, his voice quieter, almost defeated. You've made up your mind. I get that. I have, Margaret said, her tone clear and resolute, and I hope one day you'll understand why. The calls didn't stop in the days that followed. Tracy called once, leaving a short and furious voicemail. Margaret didn't reply. Jimmy called twice more, alternating between pleading and demanding. Each time Margaret answered calmly, her words careful but unwavering. The decision has been made. I suggest you use the next few weeks to plan your move. By the end of the week, the calls slowed, and silence filled the gaps where their voices had once lived. Margaret sat in her quiet home, staring at the familiar contract on her counter. She knew the fallout of her decision wasn't over, that Jimmy and Tracy's anger might not fade anytime soon. But even so, she knew she had done what she needed to do, and she could almost hear Richard's voice in her ear, as steady and strong as it had always been. Don't let anyone forget your worth, Maggie. For Margaret, standing firm wasn't about winning a battle, it was about reclaiming a legacy, and herself. The house returns to the mother. Margaret stared at the old Denver house as it loomed in front of her. Its facade looked lifeless now, the once vibrant shutters slightly faded and the snow piling up unevenly along the edges of the driveway. The windows, once filled with light and energy, now stared back at her, still and empty. It had been 2 months since Jimmy and Tracy had vacated, and though they had respected the legal notice to leave within 30 days, Margaret imagined their parting words had filled the rooms with bitterness. The house hadn't always been this still. She remembered the day Richard and she had first seen it, how they'd walked through its halls, envisioning Christmas mornings and backyard barbecues with their grandchildren someday. Margaret could practically hear Richard's voice beside her now as she fumbled with the keys to open the front door. "Take a deep breath, Maggie," she whispered to herself. The cold air nipped at her cheeks, but she didn't mind. Holding one hand against the door for support, she turned the key slowly. The lock clicked open and the door swung inward with a quiet creak that echoed through the empty entryway. Margaret stepped across the threshold, her boots crunching softly against the hardwood floors, now coated with a faint layer of dust. The air was faintly stale, carrying a chill that seeped into every corner of the silent house. For a long moment all she could do was stand there, taking it all in. Memories seemed to flood the room as if they had been waiting for her to return. The house had never belonged to her in this way. Not really. It had been a gift to Jimmy and Tracy, a symbol of her and Richard's sacrifices, but now that it was hers again, it felt like somewhere between a cold inheritance and a bittersweet reclamation. She couldn't help but wonder if the house remembered her, if the walls still carried the faint echoes of her and Richard's laughter from the day they handed the keys to Jimmy. Her eyes scanned the living room. Tracy had stripped everything away when they left, taking down photos, furniture, and even the decorative curtains she had once proudly installed. The house felt hollow, as though it were grieving too. Margaret dropped her purse onto the floor near the staircase, the thud reverberating in the empty space. She wandered slowly, her fingers brushing along the paint-chipped banister as she ascended the stairs. Each creaky step brought another memory. She could almost see Richard in her mind's eye, hauling up a dresser while grumbling about never-ending home improvement projects, his chuckles breaking through his complaints. "Don't kill yourself over the stairs, Richie," she thought with a small sad smile. He had always loved tinkering with things, fixing what needed fixing and adding creative touches she would never have thought of. Much of his handiwork was still there. Nail marks from his attempts to hang Jimmy's childhood baseball plaques in the upstairs hallway, a carved RJMJ discreetly pressed into the wooden panel of the banister. Margaret's fingers paused on the carving, tracing it slowly. It startled her how raw the memories still felt. She had expected the house to feel like a burden when she returned, like a hollow relic of love misplaced. But the deeper she went, the more it felt like Richard had left pieces of himself here. She walked into what once had been Jimmy's bedroom, now stripped bare. She could hardly believe the room had once been alive with messy piles of toys and the sound of a young boy excitedly talking about Little League. Back downstairs, Margaret noticed something strange in the kitchen, a box sitting squarely on the countertop. It wasn't hers, and her heart briefly quickened at the thought that maybe Jimmy had left it behind. She approached cautiously, lifting the lid to find a folded letter and 2 small picture frames wrapped in cloth. "Mom," the letter began in Jimmy's familiar scrawl. Margaret held her breath as she read, "I don't know if you'll find this, but I hope you do. I didn't know what to leave behind when we moved out. We talked about a lot of things in the past month, but I never said what I really wanted to say. I'm sorry. Not just for the way things turned out, but for the way we treated you when you came. I've been thinking a lot about Dad and everything he taught me. I don't think he'd be proud of how I've acted. You didn't deserve to feel like you were an outsider in something you built with your own hands and heart." Margaret felt her throat tighten as she continued reading. "The truth is, I took you and Dad for granted. I told myself that your sacrifices were just what parents do, and that made it easy to forget just how much they meant. The house wasn't supposed to become a wedge between us, but I let it. Tracy did too. I can't say I blame you for what you did, even if I'm still working through the hurt of it all. I hope someday you can trust me again." The letter went on, mentioning how the pictures in the wrapped frames were of Margaret and Richard's wedding day and Jimmy's Little League trophy ceremony. Jimmy ended it by asking her to keep the house alive, to make it hers again. Margaret wiped at her eyes with the sleeve of her coat, carefully folding the letter. She unwrapped the frames, smiling faintly at the wedding photo she hadn't seen in years. Richard was still leaning on that easy, unforgettable grin of his as he stood in his ill-fitted suit beside her. And the Little League photo transported her back to sticky summer evenings, cheering for Jimmy with cold lemonade cups in hand. For as much as she loved these tokens, Margaret couldn't help but feel the weight of Jimmy's words. Forgiveness wasn't easy, and rebuilding trust even less so. But the house called to her. It whispered of second chances, not just for Jimmy but for her as well. Maybe it wasn't too late to restore what had been broken. Steeling herself, Margaret glanced around the kitchen, the old tile that Richard had spent 3 weekends installing, the window that once overlooked a thriving backyard garden. She felt something shift within her, something that threaded hope back into her heart. In the weeks that followed, Margaret poured herself into making the house her own. She rubbed away the dust of time, scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, and hung fresh curtains over the windows. But she didn't erase the past. Richard's little carved initials remained, as did the marks where Jimmy had once hung his baseball plaques. The neighbors, curious about her return, began stopping by. A casserole here, a pot of soup there, and soon Margaret was surrounded by people who had lived nearby but never truly known her. She made an effort to engage with them, host small coffee mornings, and reweave herself into the community. The house didn't feel lonely anymore, and neither did she. When spring arrived, Margaret decided to plant a new garden in the backyard, just as Richard would have done. It wasn't long before Jimmy called one evening, his voice softer than she remembered. They talked cautiously at first, leaving the heavier subjects for another time. But during that call he asked her to send pictures of the house. Margaret didn't miss the note of longing in his voice, and for the first time in months, she felt a small but genuine smile grace her face. "This house really is home again," she whispered to herself that night before heading to bed. Richard's voice echoed faintly in her heart. "You're stronger than you think, Maggie, always have been." And for the first time in years, Margaret believed it. A time to heal. Margaret sat quietly in her living room, the aroma of freshly brewed tea mingling with the faint scent of spring that wafted in through the slightly open window. The past few months had been heavy, full of conflict, emotional turmoil and uncertainty. But now in the stillness of her home, Margaret felt a shift, a subtle yet unmistakable lightness in the air. It had been 3 months since Jimmy and Tracy moved out of the Denver house, and Margaret had spent that time carefully tending to the fractured parts of her life. First, she threw herself into refurbishing the house, scrubbing away the dust and faint traces of sorrow that had lingered in the empty rooms. The act of cleaning, of putting things in order, wasn't just about the house, it was about her. Every swipe of a cloth or stroke of a brush felt like reclaiming a part of herself that had been worn down by years of neglect. Neglect by others, and truthfully neglect by her own hands as she let herself wait endlessly for people to come to her. Margaret's days turned into a newfound routine. She'd rise early, the morning light streaming through the windows, casting long, inviting shadows across the living room. There were no calls from Jimmy in the first few weeks, no texts, no fumbling apologies or explanations, but that absence didn't unnerve her the way it once might have. Instead, Margaret discovered something within herself, a quiet resolve to be whole, whether or not her son chose to rebuild their strained connection. One day, as Margaret sat at her kitchen table sketching an idea for a small herb garden outside, the phone rang. She hesitated before answering. It wasn't Jimmy, like she might have guessed. It was her neighbor, Francis, whose bubbly voice poured through the receiver. "Margaret, we're having another one of our Sunday potlucks. It's nothing fancy, mostly casseroles, but we'd love to see you there," Francis said. Margaret paused, the pen in her hand stilling over her notebook. She'd avoided social gatherings for so long, hesitant to move beyond her isolation, but now, something told her to say yes. "I think I'd like that," Margaret responded, a faint tremor in her voice, nervousness tempered by the warmth of Francis's invitation. By the time Sunday arrived, Margaret found herself standing in Francis's backyard, surrounded by laughter, the clinking of serving spoons, and the low hum of conversation. She was cautious at first, smiling politely and keeping to herself. But as the evening wore on, she felt herself opening up, sharing laughs over a particularly salty pecan pie, and trading stories of bygone days with other members of the neighborhood she had long overlooked. For the first time in years, Margaret felt a glimmer of community, a renewed faith that she could build bonds not just with people from her past, but also with those who were present, right here, offering her kindness and connection. Little by little, those Sunday gatherings became a regular part of her life, something she looked forward to as much as the quiet, reflective mornings in her own home. When summer arrived, Margaret began planting her herb garden, as she'd planned. Along the fence, She added rose bushes, their blossoms bursting in shades of pink and red that Richard had always loved. Neighbors often stopped by to admire her work, and more than once, someone left a batch of fresh cookies or a jar of homemade jam on her porch. It wasn't just neighbors who began to fill Margaret's days with small joys. One afternoon, as she sat on her porch trimming lavender stems, she heard the familiar ringtone of her phone vibrating against the wooden side table. This time, it was Jimmy. Her heart jumped slightly and for a moment doubt crept in. She wondered if this call would bring the same tense arguments as before. But when she answered, Jimmy's voice was quieter, softer. "Hi, Mom," he started. "Hi, Jimmy," she said, a cautious warmth in her tone. "How are you?" There was a pause on his end, and Margaret felt the weight of his hesitation through the phone. "I've been thinking," he said eventually, "about everything, about the house, about Dad, well, the way I let things slip." Margaret didn't speak immediately. She wanted to give him space to let him find his words. "I know I haven't been a good son," Jimmy continued, his voice carrying a tone that Margaret hadn't heard in years, earnestness. "I know I hurt you. And Tracy, well, we've both been talking. I think we both let things get too comfortable, you know? Like we thought you'd just always be there and we didn't stop to think what that silence was doing to you." Margaret felt her chest tighten, the familiar ache of longing resurfacing, but this time it didn't feel unbearable. "It's never too late to change, Jimmy," she said gently. "I'm glad to hear you're thinking about these things. I won't lie, what happened hurt me deeply, but what I want more than anything is for us to move forward." "That's what I want too. I just didn't know how to say it before." They talked for nearly an hour, sharing more words in that single conversation than they had in years. Jimmy asked about the house, about the garden, about the little touches Margaret had added to make the space hers again. He told her about the boys, how they were settling into their new rental, how they had been drawing pictures of Grandma's house and asking when they could visit. Margaret felt an unexpected warmth bloom in her chest. "They're always welcome here, Jimmy, you're all welcome. I want to rebuild this relationship too." Her words were firm but tender, carrying a quiet optimism. Over the following weeks, small, meaningful changes began to punctuate their lives. Jimmy called more often, sometimes just to check in or share a small moment from his day. Tracy even left Margaret a thoughtful voicemail one evening, thanking her for some school supplies she'd mailed for the grandkids. And while their relationship wasn't fully healed, Margaret felt that old wounds were beginning to close. The once empty house now felt alive in its own quiet way. Each phone call, each laugh shared with a neighbor, each photo sent of her grandkids' smiling faces, added threads to a tapestry of belonging. Reconnection. Margaret stood in her newly cleaned kitchen, staring at her tea kettle as it hummed gently on the stove. She was lost in thought when her phone buzzed on the counter. Glancing at the screen, her heart skipped. It was Jimmy. It had been weeks since their last tense interaction, and she had convinced herself she might not hear from him for a long time. Slowly, she picked up the phone, taking a steady breath before swiping to answer. "Hi, Jimmy," she said, her voice calm but cautious. "Hey, Mom," came Jimmy's voice on the other end. It was quieter than she remembered, almost hesitant. Not the usual confident tone he had always carried. "Do you, have a minute to talk?" Margaret glanced at the kettle, reaching over to turn off the burner as the steam began to rise. "Of course, Jimmy. What's on your mind?" There was a pause, the kind of silence that Margaret had come to dread. She could hear him shifting in the background as if he were pacing. Finally he spoke. "Mom, I know I haven't been the best son lately," he began awkwardly, "or really for a long time. I know I've hurt you." Margaret leaned against the counter, her hand gripping the edge for balance. "Jimmy," she said softly, "I'm glad you called. But let's not dance around it. We both know things have been strained." He exhaled loudly on the other end, and she could picture him running a hand through his hair the way Richard used to when he was frustrated or nervous. "Yeah, strained is putting it lightly. I just don't know where to start. There's so much I should have said and I didn't, so much I didn't do when I should have." Margaret tilted her head, letting the ache in her chest subside for a moment. "Why don't you start with the truth then, Jimmy?" Jimmy let out a dry laugh. "The truth is, I messed up, Mom. I let my life get so wrapped up in my work, the kids and Tracy. Everything felt so overwhelming and I just didn't prioritize you. I didn't show you how much you mean to me and I guess I thought you'd always be there no matter what." Margaret closed her eyes, letting his words settle deep. For all their years of distance, this was the first time he had taken real responsibility, no excuses, no deflecting. It was raw and real, and she could feel the sincerity in every syllable. You're right, Margaret said after a moment. I did feel like I was the last priority. I've spent so many years wondering if you'd even notice if I wasn't here anymore, Jimmy. That's a heavy thing to carry as a mother. Her voice faltered slightly, but she steadied herself. And when I came to Denver— I know, Jimmy interrupted, guilt thick in his voice. I've replayed that day in my head 1,000 times. I could see it in your eyes, how hurt you were. And Tracy, she and I have talked about it a lot. She feels terrible about how we handled things too. I think we both let our stress and routines blind us to what truly matters. Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but fought to maintain her composure. Jimmy, thank you for saying that. It means more than you know. But words only go so far. You know that. I do, he replied quickly. And I'm not just calling to apologize, I want to make things right, Mom. I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately. About what he'd say if he saw the way I've been acting. I think he'd be ashamed of me. Oh, Jimmy, Margaret said, her voice breaking slightly. Your father wouldn't be ashamed. Disappointed, maybe. But more than anything, he'd want to see you take responsibility and grow from it. And I do too. There was another pause, this time softer, as if the weight had lifted slightly between them. So, where do we go from here, Mom? Jimmy asked, his vulnerability palpable. How do I prove to you that I'm serious about fixing this? Margaret took a moment to think, her fingers tracing the edge of the counter absent-mindedly. For starters, she said eventually, don't wait for me to reach out anymore. You call me Jimmy. Not because you feel guilty, but because you genuinely want me in your life. Let me know what's happening with you, with Tracy, the kids, everything, and invite me to be part of that. I don't want to feel like an outsider anymore. You're not an outsider, Mom, Jimmy said quickly. You're my family. Then show me, Margaret said simply. And when you're ready, I'd like to see the boys again. It's been so long since I've spent time with them. I feel like I've missed so much. You're right, Jimmy admitted, his voice softening. They miss their grandma too. Honestly, they've been asking lately why we haven't visited you. I didn't have a good answer for them, and I felt like a complete jerk. Margaret smiled faintly, her heart aching with a bittersweet kind of hope. They're good boys, Jimmy, and I'd love to have them visit. Maybe this summer we can plan something. A real visit. Not just a holiday card or a quick phone call. I'd like that, Jimmy said. A lot. Over the next few weeks, Jimmy began to follow through on his promise. The phone calls became more frequent. It wasn't much at first, but it was a start. He would call after dinner, sharing updates about work, funny things the boys had done, and even small compliments about Margaret's resilience. Tracy called once too, leaving a voicemail that was surprisingly warm. Margaret, I just wanted to thank you for sending those books for the boys. They haven't put them down all week. We really appreciate you thinking of them. The conversations were still cautious. Margaret could sense that everyone was tiptoeing around the elephant in the room, but with each call, each text, Margaret felt a little less of the sharp pain she had carried for so long. One day Jimmy said, Mom, the boys are drawing pictures of your house all the time now. They've been asking if we could send them to you. Margaret chuckled lightly, feeling her chest warm at the thought. I'd love that, Jimmy. Tell them I'll hang their artwork right on the fridge. And, Jimmy added, his voice quieter now, maybe we could bring the boys by for a weekend. You know, let them see the house and spend time with you. I'd like that, Margaret said, her voice soft but filled with genuine joy. I'd like that very much. The house that had once felt so empty was beginning to welcome life again. Margaret could feel the threads of her family slowly weaving together, though frayed in places, still capable of mending. It wasn't perfect, and Margaret knew there would still be bumps along the way. But for the first time in years, she felt that reconnection wasn't just a dream, it was a choice, one that both she and Jimmy were finally committing to. A hopeful ending. The sun dipped lower into the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the Denver house's backyard. Margaret stood leaning against the porch railing, sipping a cup of tea as she watched the rose bushes sway gently in the evening breeze. The house felt different now, warm and inviting, as if it had been waiting all these years for its original owner to return and breathe life back into it. For months, Margaret had been rebuilding, not just the house, but herself. Small things had started to shift since that first phone call with Jimmy. The tension that had once defined their interactions seemed to dissipate with each genuine word shared between them. It was far from perfect, but the foundation of something new, something better, was beginning to form. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing loudly on the kitchen counter behind her. Picking it up, she smiled faintly at the caller ID. It was Jimmy. She answered after the first ring this time. Hi, Jimmy, she said softly, her heart tugging at the familiarity of his voice. How are things? Hey, Mom. Jimmy responded warmly. There was no hesitation now, no awkward pauses that had once littered their conversations. Everything's good. The boys are driving Tracy and me crazy with excitement. They can't stop talking about coming to see you this weekend. Toby's been planning what he wants to do the second we step out of the car. He's got a whole itinerary and it involves a lot of cookies, apparently. Margaret chuckled, the sound light and genuine. Cookies, hmm? Well, I think I can manage that. You know, ginger snaps were always his favorite when he was younger. Oh, he hasn't forgotten. He's been telling his little brother all about how you make the best cookies in the world, Jimmy said, his voice carrying a smile she could feel through the phone. Margaret's heart swelled at the thought of her grandchildren in the backyard, laughing and running around as if no time had passed since the last time she'd seen them. For so long she had feared losing them, not just physically, but emotionally. Yet here she was, hearing their excitement as second-hand whispers through Jimmy's voice, and it felt as though she had been given a chance to write a new chapter with them. I can't wait to see them, she said after a moment. I've been working on the rose bushes and even put together a little corner in the garden for them. It's got some herbs and strawberries. Figured it'd be fun for the boys to help me pick them. That sounds great, Mom, Jimmy replied, quieter now. I'm really glad we're doing this. I didn't think I'd feel this way again, you know? But talking to you, hearing you laugh again, it's been good for me, for all of us. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle in her chest. It's been good for me too, Jimmy, better than I can say. I thought for a long time that maybe it was too late for us. I thought too much had been said, or left unsaid. Me too, Jimmy admitted, but sometimes, you just have to start where you are, don't you? We can't undo the past, but we can try to do better going forward. Dad would have wanted that. Margaret smiled softly, her gaze drifting out to the garden where the first stars had begun to twinkle faintly in the evening sky. He would have wanted us to love each other through it all. He'd be proud of you, Jimmy. I know I am. Thanks, Mom, Jimmy said, his tone full of emotion. That means a lot, and I promise, I'm not going to let us drift apart again, not this time. She nodded, even though he couldn't see it. Good, because I want these boys to know their grandma, not just from pictures or stories. I want them to grow up knowing they're part of something bigger, part of this family. They will, he assured her. We'll make sure of it. Margaret felt a peace settle over her, the kind she hadn't felt since Richard passed. For the first time in years, hope didn't feel like a fragile thing, ready to shatter at a moment's notice. It felt sturdy, like the walls of this house, like the roots of the rose bushes she had planted with Richard so long ago. The weekend arrived more quickly than Margaret anticipated. She stood in the driveway, her hands nervously clasped in front of her, as Jimmy's car pulled in with a crunch of gravel. The boys tumbled out of the back seat immediately, their faces glowing with the unrestrained joy of children. "Grandma!" Toby yelled before sprinting toward her, his younger brother Ethan clambering out behind him with slightly less coordination but no less enthusiasm. Margaret laughed and knelt down, extending her arms wide to catch them both as they barreled into her. "My goodness, you two have grown like weeds," Margaret exclaimed, hugging them tightly. She felt the warmth of their small arms wrapping around her, and for a moment, all the years of distance and misunderstanding melted away. Jimmy stepped out of the car next, carrying a small bag in one hand and looking at Margaret with a smile that was softer than she'd seen in years. Tracy followed shortly, looking slightly shy but offering a small wave as she approached. Margaret met her halfway, pulling her into an embrace that she hadn't planned but suddenly felt was entirely necessary. "It's good to see you, Tracy," Margaret said sincerely. "You too," Tracy replied, her voice just as soft. "Thanks for having us." "Of course," Margaret said, stepping back and glancing at her family, all together finally on the same ground. "Let's go inside. I've got cookies in the oven and a whole lot of catching up to do with these boys." Jimmy chuckled as he ushered the kids toward the house. "You're going to spoil them rotten, Mom, aren't you?" "That's my job as a grandma," Margaret replied with a wink, holding the door open as everyone poured inside. By the end of the evening, the house was filled with laughter, the smell of warm cookies, and the sound of children's feet scurrying down the hallway. Margaret sat at the dining table watching as Toby and Ethan showed off their drawings to Jimmy and Tracy, their voices overlapping in excited bursts. Her eyes wandered to the mantel above the fireplace, where she had placed the picture Jimmy had left in the box on the counter, the one of her and Richard on their wedding day. She smiled, feeling his presence in the room, in the walls, in the laughter. "You'd be proud, Richie," she whispered under her breath. "Of all of us." For the first time in years, Margaret felt like the house wasn't just hers, it was home for her whole family, And as the stars twinkled outside, she allowed hope to fill every corner of her heart, because this was just the beginning.